Good night, everybody. Welcome. We are hoping that Mr. Giovanni will conclude the presentation today on British colonization up to 1859 with the Treaty of the Anglo-Guatemalan Agreement. It is also our hope that at some point we'll have somebody from Foreign Affairs to give us up-to-date information on the state of the dispute at the International Court of Justice. So in the previous two presentations, Mr. Giovanni, in number one, he kind of explained in a nutshell the whole reason why Europeans came to the New World, so to speak. Those motives that drove colonization eventually, how the Americas ended up being divided among two principal world powers, then Portugal and Spain, and subsequently other countries came in like France, Holland, Britain, which later became an empire world power as well, no? As Spain declined in power. And from this, he kind of last presentation, it took us through the whole reason why Belize ended up being a colony. And what I want you to note as well is that transition of governance, no, the progression of governance, of constitutional governance. Mr. Giovanni spoke about Barnaby's Code as the first constitution back in the 1700s, and how eventually, though this place was claimed by Spain, it ended up being British in administration. So it had to have some kind of governance in the course of from the 1600s onwards until independence. So I want you to note that as well. So Mr. Giovanni spoke about treaties, the Treaty of Madrid, the Convention, a couple of other treaties that kind of establish borders or limits of occupation. And he will continue with that today and taking it all the way up to 1859. Good night, Mr. Giovanni. It's all yours now.
Thank you, Mr. Dave. Good night, everyone. All right. Let me start off the night by actually asking you for your questions thus far. Let's take a couple minutes to deal with some questions that you may still have pending. Anyone? Anyone? Any questions? All right. If it seems that the explanations thus far are okay with you. So I just want to go back to the 1783 Treaty of Versailles. This was after the American War of Independence. And as you can note, and as I said last time, the area that is in brown is what the Spanish formally agreed that the British could use, even though Spain retained sovereignty over the territory. This Treaty of Versailles would propel the English into the area even more so, particularly because at this time, woods such as mahogany, cedar, Santa Maria, and other such timber were fetching a better price on the world market. And so that in itself then became a catalyst for further colonization of the territory.
We lost your voice, Mr. Giovanni. Mr. Giovanni. Mr. Giovanni. Seems Mr. Giovanni is having some technical problems.
All right, I'm back. Okay. I'm back, Mr. Dave. I was simply asking for anyone who has questions, so that then we can move on from this section.
Any questions at this point?
All right, if none, then it's just a reminder here that in looking at this section, we have to bear in mind that there were international forces that propelled the English to remain within the area.
We're not, are you sharing? We're not seeing your screen.
You're not seeing my screen. I should be sharing. Let me see, share screen. How now?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so in this general area, in this general map of the region, it is the brown section then that the Spanish permitted the English to remain. This, of course, plays out into what was then a global conflict, one where Spain, who had been the superpower up to that date, was now beginning to lose, to some degree, her authority over territories. This is the epoch when such themes as the Enlightenment plays a role, where the native population, particularly those living in what is the USA, began to challenge the authority of the monarch. They began to challenge the authority vested in those people who represented the English king and charged them taxes. These were individuals who were not prepared to follow the dictates of the monarch of England in the case of the US. And as we will see later on, even in the Spanish territories, they were not happy about the way the monarchy was functioning. And this is because there were philosophers in Europe whose idea of what independence means, of what liberty and freedom signified, that they began to challenge the authority of, of those European states. As a result, then, following the end of the American War of Independence, at the Treaty of Versailles is signed. And Versailles, as you know, is in France. And on that 3rd of September 1783, a document is presented, and Article 6 of that document allowed for the British to formally use lands that were between the Rio Hondo and included sections along the new river, the Rio Nuevo, and towards the Belize River, or the Vallis or Wallis or Wallix River. At the time, timber such as mahogany, cedar, Santa Maria, bullet tree, and so on had gained a level of importance. It had gained a higher level of importance, and as a result, then these settlers, quote unquote, turned away from simply cutting logwood to cutting a more profitable type of timber. And so the British then, in engaging in that economic activity, begin to establish a stronger presence. In short, the colonization of the territory became even more strong. Okay. All right. So we had spoken about the Mosquito kingship, people from Nicaragua, and yeah, if you see the guy seated with the white beard, somebody told me in one of the classes that I had presented this photograph that it looked like somebody in Belize. Who in Belize looks like that gentleman seated on the far left front row, the bearded fellow?
Mr. Calvillion.
That's right, our own Governor General. True? Yes, and Dr. Young's family apparently had connections with the Mosquito kingship. For many years, St. John's Anglican Cathedral, in fact, historically, St. John's Anglican Cathedral, which you see, the image of the church that you see here, is the oldest Anglican church to be constructed in Central America. Mind you, there were English people in Guatemala, there were English people in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in Costa Rica, all over. Yet the oldest Anglican church was built in Belize. The bottom photographs show the current Mosquito king. Yes, he exists as a king in Nicaragua. And as you can see on the bottom, you see Bishop Wright, who officiated, Bishop Wright of the Anglican Church, who officiated the ascension of the king. I forgot his name. All right. But there are connections. And I bring this out because the Convention of London, which was signed on the 14th of July of 1786, was as a result of negotiations between the British and the English over the territory of Nicaragua, over the settlers, the English settlers in particular, who lived in the territory of Nicaragua, where the Mosquito kings were, the Mosquito people were to be found. And so, because the English and the Spanish were at peace at the time, and the English who had settled in Belize were demanding that the English crown provides for them more territory. The Convention of London of 1786 allowed for that. And so an extension is made south of the Belize River towards the Sibun River. all the articles in this Convention of London deal with how Spain and England agreed to allow the presence of the English in the territory. On this map, as you can see, the brown and pink areas were technically granted to the English, even though the Spanish retained control.
Mr.
They retained
Giovanni,
sovereignty. Yes.
this is when the condition was that they had to move out of the
Yes, they had to
Atlantic coast.
evacuate. They had to evacuate the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua and Honduras. And I think my next slide is going to show you some of the things, some names too. All right. The fact remains, though, if you notice, this is the last treaty that is signed between Spain and England over the territory that is called Belize. It is such that the yellow area belonged, in fact, the entire area belonged to Spain. But what is here in the yellow area today is perhaps what Guatemala, actually Guatemala is claiming the whole thing. But there was a period of time when Guatemala was only claiming the areas colored in yellow, the areas of what we know today as Belize, covered in yellow along with the keys. Okay. Again, in this section, you can clearly see the southern, towards the south of the map, you can see where the English had settled. And in fact, if you saw the destruction caused by, was it Iota or ETA, there was a video of people in Nicaragua, I think in the Corn Islands and in San Andres, speaking very much Creole, just like in Belize. All right. So it's the people then would have to move out from all those territories of Black River southward to Punta Gorda on what is the southern coast, the southern Caribbean coastline of Honduras to Nicaragua, respectively. Any questions? Out of that, then we see how the English are resettled in Belize, and these are copies of maps that date to that epoch of 1786, showing where the English were expected to reside. Here's a closer look at the map, and as you will see, you will note that some names appear to be upside down. This is because cartography at the time was taken from the sea line looking into the territory. And here's an important document. This actually comes from the London Gazette, and this has to do with the 1786 treaty. And as you will notice on this, the king has been pleased to grant to Henry Pelham of Crowhurst in the county, etc., etc. And here's a list. If you notice, there's a list of, you can see can you see my cursor? At Whitehall Treasury Chambers on August 28, 1792. This is a few years after 1786. There's a list of persons to whom compensation was granted because they had lost some of their people and equipment and materials when they were evacuating the Mosquito Shore. But look at some of these individuals who came to Belize. For those of you who have traveled or who will be traveling across Belize later on, I just want to highlight a few things from some of the names. And in fact, if you do more history, you will be familiar with these. I'm looking at the list of names. Colonel James Pitt Laurie. You notice where my cursor is? James Pitt Laurie, There's up north, when you look at the map of Belize, up north, there's an area called Lawry's Bight. Lawry's Bight. It is in the Bay of Corozal. Another one, Robert Douglas. There's a community, there's a village in the Orinjuak district called Douglas. John Neal. Notice the surname, John Neal. David Lamb he was the first person to survey the south side of Belize. I'll skip Thomas Burke, but I'll talk about Robert Cummings, who would later on have a child who was a doctor in Belize. Steve Stan, notice again Steve Stan. Could that have been the origin of Stan Creek? James Dondridge Yabra. James Dondridge Yabra. You hear about the Yabra Cemetery just across from the Anglican Cathedral in Belize City. And this James Dondridge Yabra was a North American who had fought against George Washington. He ended up living in Nicaragua and later on coming to Belize. All right, Catherine Ernest, Lydia Tunniston, Mary Monson. I'm coming to the middle, Sandwith and Company, James Usher. James Usher, a lot of the families in Belize can trace their ancestry to James Usher. As William Keane, George Bonner. Today we hear Banner. There's a song called Mr. Banner, Mr. Banner, Mr. Banner, Mr. Banner. Tiger Gun with your dog. You know, Mr. Banner. John Myvet. Jonathan Card. His story is an interesting one. Jonathan Card. He was an older folk when he came here, and he ended up having children with Maria Perez. Maria Perez, who had been captured out in Nicaragua in 1782, as an example of others. Look at David Evans. There's an area out by Sand Hill going towards the seaside that is known as Evans Gate. Crawford, George Crawford, Joshua Jones. Some of these names, as you look through the listing of names of people in Belize, you realize that these are more than likely the people who were who had settled in the area. Basil Jones, those of you who have gone to San Pedro and Burg Risky, there's an area north of San Pedro known as Basil Jones. All right, Henry Mascal, another of the older villages in Belize. George Moody, and if you heard about the two Moody brothers in the River Valley fighting over cattle, you know, Smith, Ramsey. Look at all those surnames, right? A lot of these names continue because they're passed on from father to child, from mother to daughter. But these are some of the individuals who evacuated the Mosquito Coast and ended up in Belize. And today these surnames are very popular. When they came, the British appointed Colonel Marcus Edward Despard, and it was through him and his lobbying that these settlers also got permission from Spain to be able to develop plantation grounds, or what were known as garden plots. But plantations became very popular, plantation, all right? And that term, the word plantation, continues today. Another word for plantation would be walk. And gone to the coconut walk. They went to the lime walk. And of course, the origin of the name Orange Walk. But it was the Spanish who appointed Rafael Llobet, an engineer, to come to Belize and demarcate the garden plots that the English wanted. After the King of Spain gave his permission that the English could now plant subsistence crops. So notice how that type of colonization begins to take on a more official form of settlement. What I have here is Rafael Llobet's diary of 1789 and a 1798 map. Okay, notice that Rafael Llobet came all the way, and if you look at this, este día, I'm reading martes 29. Oops, what happened here? What happened here? Let's share back the screen. All right, let me get back to that. Should share the full screen. All right, we're back with that. Notice all the areas that Rafael Llobet visited. Este día, you noticing martes 29. Este día me fue preciso demorarme en dicha Punta Gorda. So he was in Punta Gorda, 1789. Para componer en el modo posible la botavara y poder seguir viaje. He was sailing. Notice that he comes to Hicacos, Cayo Hicacos, that is down south. Río Mono. And notice, habiéndome largado de Punta Hicacos, me fondié en la boca de Río Mono, célebre por los indios bravos. In 1789, this Spanish army officer had traveled from Punta Hicacos, all right, all the way to Río Mono. Can someone interpret Río Mono in English? Translate. Hello. People can sleep. You're pretending to be there.
Monkey River.
That is right, Monkey River. And it was célebre por los indios bravos. There were Maya Indians who were believed to be wild, living in the area of Monkey River in 1789. Yet, some years ago, and I'm deviating from the text, but to show you how colonization has an impact. Yet, in the early, in about 2008, 2012, 2013, thereon, the former commissioner of lands, the former archaeological commissioner, Jaime Awe, was being forced to say that there were no Maya here when the English came. But we know that that is not the case. So again, diaries, for us who study history, we look for primary sources, and I've been lucky to find these documents that prove the presence of individuals in this area. All right, here we go. A little, you all familiar with this, right? Oh, I should have noted it. Yeah, that's all right. How many of you have one of these? Things rough, true? On our $5 bill, there are pieces, they're pieces of history. All right, they're pieces of history that highlight the epoch coming into the 19th century, into the 20th century. Sorry, 19th century. Yeah, because we're dealing with the 1800s yet. All right. There are several watermarks that our $5 bill has, and there are 6 historical motifs. Just quickly, let's see if we can get you to guess what are some of the motifs that are found on the $5 bill. The front side will have one major motif related to colonization. On the reverse of the $5 bill, we will find 5 more. Anyone?
Is it the coat of arms?
The coat of arms will date to the 1820s. We're looking for historical data that is before 1800. Yeah, the coat of arms will date to 1821, and later it would be developed until the actual coat of arms that we use now is 1950. All right, there's one. There's another one. Notice the arrows are pointing at the motifs. Anyone can identify? You did a nice try there with the coat of arms.
The map of George's Bay.
Say again?
The map we see there, St. George's Cay, the battle that we hold there.
Ah, okay, Jackie, the map with, was that Jackie, right?
Yes.
Who just spoke? Yeah. Yeah, the map. St. George's Key. Excellent. You got good memory. All right. Somebody else? Come on, we need to identify 5 more. Jackie has found one, the map of St. George's Key. In fact, all of those in the all of these motifs are at St. George's Key originally.
Mister, could the house be the court?
Ah, you think the house is a courthouse. That's a good try. That's a good try.
Wasn't that the old bank?
The old bank, as in Benqueviejo?
Yeah.
All right. All right. Let's see. Come on, people. Come on, people. I'll give you another minute to come up with answers. Let's do that quickly. I know you can.
Mister, the cannon, the battle against the Spanish?
There we go. Excellent. Excellent answer. You get full points there. So the map and the cannon, full points for those.
Is that the House of Culture?
The House of Culture. No. Remember, I said all of these are in St. George's Key. It's a pity that we can't take a trip to St. George's Key, true? Johnny Searle would enjoy telling you all the stories that he knows from St. George's Key. All right, let's see the answers. The medallion from Thomas Potts' Crypt. Thomas Potts was one of those British slave owners. He is said to have said that whoever did not want to fight against the Spanish at the Battle of St. George's Key did not deserve a piece of Belizean land. And today, look at who are taking control of the land. There you go, the map of St. George's Key, a map of 1764. Remember, I had done a slide that kind of showed who were some of the people living there. Biddle's house. Actually, the name of the gentleman who lived in that house was not Biddle, it was Vidal. Vidal. And he was a Portuguese Spaniard. But notice that he changed his name to Biddle. You know, it's like some people whose name is Maria. Oh, no, they're not named Maria, they're named Mary or Marie. Or the guy who no longer goes by the name Jose is now Joseph. Here's the other one, the cannon, and that's a 9-pounder. You have different sizes of cannons. That is the burial crypt of Thomas Potts. And if you look at the center of the crypt, you see that? See my arrow there? The cursor? That medallion is the same one in the front of the $5 bill. And no, it was not the courthouse. That was a good try. It was actually a bathing crawl. Still exists, areas like those still exist on St. George's Key. So, what propelled look, cartoons give you a lot of history. All right, and that's why I put this one with cartoons. What was going on in the 1800s? We see the challenge of England trying to establish herself through colonial methods. Many of those territories that English expansion created were either by treaty or war, or treaties at the end of wars. Some of them were negotiated as the result of one war giving another. The Americans by then had begun to establish a control, a hegemony, and they used the Monroe Doctrine to their favor. They were saying, all the territories of the Americas for Americans. Today we see those effects, true? The US does not see eye to eye with Cuba. It does not see eye to eye with Venezuela. You know, the English again established themselves in the territory. Here is a map of Belize. It's not the map as you would immediately recognize, but it shows you territories that the English were in effect taking control of. And so to understand the dynamics of the British move, like the Energizer bunny that kept going and going and going, the territory that had been granted to them from the Rio Hondo towards the Sibun River was too small. And so they kept going outside of the boundary limits. By then, issues happening with Spain were not the best. And so Spain kind of abandoned the territory. So in effect, you have a dereliction of territory. And the English therefore applied what is known as acquisitive prescription. That can be summed up in the proverb that you remember the saying, finders keepers. What's the next part? Finders keepers.
Is it losers weepers?
Losers weepers. That is right. At least I have one person listening keenly to me. Oh, sorry, I know some people were trying to unmute themselves so that they could provide an answer, but that's fine. All right, so there are two technicalities, there are two technical legal terms that are used. De jure means by law. De juramento, if you want to think about it in Spanish, de jure. So by law, the entire territory had been Spanish territory. But the English had been granted permission by law, by virtue of the treaties, to use certain areas of the territory. The reality, de facto, in fact, the real thing on the ground was that the British had moved beyond the boundary limits. And so by 1814, by 1802, I mean, we can see how the British were moving further away. Again, in doing my research, I came across this illustration in one of the Spanish archival documents. And we see how this Spanish captain came from Guatemala and drew a map, and he mentions La Colonia Inglesa. Following the fights between Britain and other countries, particularly against Spain, treaties would be signed, and the Treaty of Amiens technically required that Britain return any territory that they had gained during the recent wars. And so for Belize then, the British should have given back St. St. George's Key and other such territories. We know that did not happen. And so throughout the early part, the first 2 decades of the 1800s, we see the rest of Central America, South America, claiming their independence from Spain. Guatemala at first joined with Mexico to form the Mexican Empire under Iturbide. It's not until 1823 that Guatemala breaks away from the Mexican Empire and declares herself completely independent. So they had done that in 1821, a declaration of independence from Spain.
Mr. Giovanni,
But yes,
before you continue, before you move ahead, I have 2 questions, no, that our
Yes.
students maybe might be interested in finding out, or maybe they've asked that questions, but they're not really wanting to question, to present a question. Was there a battle of St. George's Key? I mean, how much of a battle was it, as we understand battles? And secondly, if there was a battle in 1798, and a treaty had been signed earlier to give permission for the British to be up all the way to the Sibun, why would the Spanish try to move them out if there was such a treaty?
All right, to settle the issue of the Battle of St. George's Key, yes, there was a confrontation. No, it was not this huge battle that we have been taught before. I participated in the research along with Dr. Angel Cal, Dr. Herman Bird of Belize, along with Dr. Gustavo Alfaro and Dr. Ramos Diaz of the University of Quintana Roo, and Dr. Juan, I keep forgetting his name, from UIMCRO, the Universidad Intercultural Maya de Quintana Roo. We had the Belize Mexico Red, which was aiming at research and presentations. We transcribed 1,217 pages, 1,217 pages of Spanish records that refer to the preparation and the execution of a plan by Arturo O'Neill de Tiron in trying to dislodge the British from the territory of Belize. And that happens in 1798. The battle as such as has been taken particularly by a political party did not occur as you would have wanted it to be. It has been taken out of context. Now, why would the Spanish try to chase the English away from the territory? Remember, colonization has to do with resources. Colonization in and of itself is the ability to control a people and their resources. And Spain, who had already begun to face some issues, economic, political, and even religious-wise, had to find ways to finance herself as a country. For example, Arturo O'Neill Tiron, while he was Captain General of Yucatan, had been requested to see to it that development should come to the people under his jurisdiction. And he thought that, and there's a letter that he actually writes to Spain saying, listen, if we change the English from that area, the amount of business that they're doing with wood, with logwood and other timber, all that profit we can use, bring it into the coffers of Yucatan, so that then the Captain General can reinvest it in developing Yucatan. So that's one. Two, the number of enslaved Africans that were running away to the north across the Rio Hondo also became an issue of concern for the Spanish. And so the main thing was that there was rivalry between Spain and England. And so why will you have settlers? Why would you have settlers who are from a country who are aligned with a country that is your enemy? So there were economic, social, political, and even religious views that led to confrontation between the Spanish and the British. And it was a war that was not only at St. George's Key. St. George's Key was just one of those little skirmishes that occurred in the whole thing. There were other more pressing matters. There were other wars, actual wars occurring elsewhere in the world between Spain and Britain that drew their attention. But this Battle of St. George's Key was in reality quite small. And so, as I mentioned, does that answer the question?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah, and so even after that, then, even though the British began to consolidate their presence in the area, we know that Spain faced issues with her settlers in Mexico, in Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, etc. All right. So by 1820, between 1823 and 1839, Guatemala establishes herself as the capital of the United Provinces of Central America. That would lead to problems too, because they needed finance, and what they began to do was to make the British pay for it, and then they would return them. At the time Spain is in trouble, Guatemala begins to assert herself. Remember that Mexico had already declared her independence. And so Guatemala then begins to see the presence of the English in what would become La Colonia Inglesa, the Honduras Británica. They began to see that presence as something to look out against. And through her leadership, Guatemala began to apply a theory called uti possidetis juris. In effect, what Guatemala was saying is, what uti possidetis juris says is precisely that a province which successfully revolts against the colonial power inherits all rights to that power, in that province, and its boundaries become those claimed by the colonial power at the time of independence. So what Guatemala was saying in effect, and let me quickly find a map. Where's that 1786 map? See, under uti possidetis, what Guatemala is saying is the following. Let me find. Yep. Guatemala is saying that brown piece and that pink piece are part of the entire yellow piece. So under uti possidetis, then Guatemala says, okay, the British, you had gotten the brown piece and you had gotten the pink piece, but all the yellow piece, which had belonged to Mother Spain, now belongs to me, because that is my inheritance when I became independent. You clear on why Guatemala originally claimed only a portion of Belize. My understanding is that at the ICJ, Guatemala is now claiming all of Belize. All of Belize, and they're doing it on their own. That, I think, is not going to hold water. We've seen it before. Nicaragua and Honduras have similar problems. Honduras and El Salvador have a similar problem. México, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, la misma cosa. By 1823, the Americans applied what became known as the Monroe Doctrine, and they said, listen, Europe, if you notice, all the countries in the coup, the European coup, what the Americans were saying, listen, Europe, you can't come the fool wrong with territories in the New World. And this has become a bone of contention for Belize because the Guatemalans have used the Monroe Doctrine to their favor. The Monroe Doctrine independent were not to be regarded as subjects to colonization by any European power. Remember, England had not yet declared Belize as one of her territories, as a colony. Even so, we see that the scenario in Belize during colonization is such that the majority of the population, despite the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, continued to live in a state of bondage, in a state of enslavement. So that at the time when emancipation came, the Belize the Belize slavers still gained because they were compensated 101 pounds, 958, sorry, 101,958 pounds, 19 shillings, 7 pence, because they had lost the enslaved population. Let me skip this. And so Belize's position then, vis-a-vis the English, became critical. It became so critical that its geopolitical scenario was very important to England. Because you see, shipping facilities, the bringing of goods to Central America from the Caribbean, from Europe and the rest of the world, Britain controlled it. And so it was the epoch of anything that is done locally is not good. Anything that came from England or the USA was better. We still have that mentality. Too many of our people think that only other countries can do things. For example, today at a session, somebody was amazed to find out that there are Belizeans who have written software, computer software. And the person who reacted is already an older fellow. And he was like, really? Belizeans can make software for computers? And I just wanted to ask where the heck that individual has been. So there are different ways of looking at how British colonization of the territory came to be. And so by 1850 then, the Americans begin to pressure the British, telling them, hey, listen, you have certain territories, you claim certain territories, but that is not correct because you shouldn't have to do that. And so they begin to apply their own position. And so, for example, under the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 19 April 1850, the US and Britain say that none of them are going to take control of any part of Central America. But we know that that is not true. The English kept going like the Energizer Bunny. Again, the Americans pressured the British to return the islands of Roatan and Bonaca to the newly independent territory of Honduras. And so, by virtue of the 1850 treaty, the Clayton Bulwer Treaty, you find that there are further discussions. And in 1856, the Dallas Clarendon Treaty is signed, and it is then that the islands of Roatan and Bonaca and Utila off the coast of Honduras were given back to Honduras. The Mosquito Coast, which did not wish to stay with Nicaragua, could not be brought along. And so the Mosquito Coast of Nicaragua became known as a protectorate. Right around the same time, 1856, 1857, there is a reassurance that the Clayton Bulwer Treaty did not violate any deals that the English had with Mexico and the territories surrounding. We know that the Sarsoon River was acknowledged as boundary, and the western boundary was being negotiated yet, and it was the expectation that in 2 years, that within 2 years, Britain would have settled her issue with Guatemala without extending her boundary. And so throughout 1859 then, early February, Charles Lennox Wyke, who was the British plenipotentiary, meets with Don Pedro de Aycinena, and they are responsible for drafting the contents of what became the Anglo-Guatemala Treaty of 1859. And so the treaty then has a preamble, and that preamble indicates what the treaty was about. Whereas the boundary between Her Britannic Majesty's settlement, can someone read, please? No student wants to read this.
Can somebody read?
I can read from the top.
Yes.
The Anglo-Guatemala Treaty 1859, Convention between Great Britain and Guatemala relative to the boundary of British Honduras, signed at Guatemala April 30, 1859, ratification exchanged at Guatemala September 12, 1859. Whereas the boundary between Her Britannic Majesty's settlement and possessions in the Bay of Honduras and the territories of the Republic of Guatemala has not yet been ascertained and marked out. It is agreed between Her Britannic Majesty and the Republic of Guatemala that the boundary between the Republic and the British settlement and possession in the Bay of Honduras, as they existed previous to and on the first day of January 1850 and have continued to exist up to the present time, was and is as follows.
Notice the title of the treaty. Notice the preamble of the treaty. The boundary between Her Britannic Majesty's settlement, that is now Belize, which is in the Bay of Honduras, and the boundary with the territory of Guatemala has not yet been ascertained and marked out. So clearly this is a treaty of territorial limits. Guatemala says it is a boundary of cession, marked as one of limits. Of course, the court will have to decide. And so is and was as follows. Let's hear someone else carry on reading. Article 1. We're now into the 1859 treaty.
Article 1. Beginning at the mouth of the river Sarstoon in the Bay of Honduras and proceeding up to the mid-channel thereof to Gracias a Dios Falls, then turning to the right and continuing by a line drawn direct from Gracias a Dios Falls to Garbots Falls on the river Belize, and from Garbots Falls due north until it strikes the Mexican frontier.
Giovanni, lost your voice.
Okay, so Article 1, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, so Article 1 again talks about beginning at the mouth of the Sarstoon River, precisely where the Guatemalans today have these patrol boats, not wanting Belizeans to travel up the Sarstoon River like it used to be. All right, so proceeding up the mid-channel there to Gracias a Dios Falls, which is right around here, which is about 36 miles. It's about 25 miles as the crow flies, but the river has all these curves and bends. And so coming to Gracias a Dios Falls and they're turning right. So in effect, if you turn right, you're going north to Garbots Falls. And this, notice the photograph of Garbots Falls, just behind the OAS office. And from there it says, it continues north until it strikes the Mexican frontier at a place called Tres Banderas or Aguas Turbias. And that's at Aguas Turbias, the monument. Mexico on that side, Belize on this side. And actually it doesn't say Belize, it says British Honduras. Someone else continues.
It is agreed and declared between the high contracting parties that all the territory to the north and east of the line of boundary above described belong to Her Britannic Majesty, and that all the territory to the south and west of the same belongs to the Republic of Guatemala.
Más claro que eso no puede estar. All the territories to the north, so north of the Sarstoon River and east of the western boundary line belongs to Her Britannic Majesty. All the land south of the Sarstoon River and west of the boundary line that is described in the previous paragraphs belongs to the Republic of Guatemala. ¿Qué más claro puede estar? And this is one of the original, if you notice the copy there, this is the original map that Henry Ray of the British Army Engineers drew as part of the work with the officer who was appointed by the Guatemalans. Article 2 speaks about the commissioners who are going to demarcate the boundary within a year of the ratification of the treaty. Article 3 of the 1859 Anglo-Guatemala Treaty says that if they cannot agree to where the boundary is, they should get a third person to be the witness, to be the arbitrator, to make the decision. Article 4 of the 1859 treaty, 4 original maps. And what you see on this slide is again a photocopy of an original map of 1859. Article 5 says, okay, listen, England, you pay for the work of the commissioners. Guatemala, you pay for the work of your commissioners and make sure that you keep an accurate record. All right. And so whatever they had to spend, they were to pay for their own. But when you use the arbitrator, then both Britain and Guatemala should pay equally, half for the arbitrator. Important, very important. Article 6 of the 1859 treaty says that the channel in the waterline of the boundary, and I want to draw your attention, can you see the cursor here? Notice the red line. The red line passes south of Sarstoon Island. That is what you see on this satellite map. All right, the boundary is to the south of Sarstoon Island. Okay, notice the geopolitical play out today, where the Guatemalan Marine and the Belizean people have confronted each other over this simple thing, which is clearly spelled out in a treaty of 1859. And then the controversial piece. Okay, somebody to read, please. Article 7, with the object of practically carrying out the views set forth in the preamble. What were the views set forth in the preamble of the convention? The preamble said, we are signing a treaty of boundary. We have not yet demarcated what is the British territory and what is Guatemalan territory. And because they wanted to, for improving and perpetuating the friendly relations that existed at that time between the two high contracting parties, meaning Guatemala and Great Britain, these two countries mutually agreed conjointly. They mutually agree conjointly to use their best efforts by taking adequate means for establishing the easiest communication, whether it be a cart road or using the river or both. All depends on what the surveying engineers recommend, and that road would have been constructed between the fittest place on the Atlantic coast, near the settlement of Belize, and the capital of Guatemala. So a road, as this map in yellow shows, a road, the area around Puerto Barrios to Guatemala City. And why would they want that road? Because England, the commerce of England on the one hand and the material prosperity of the Republic of Guatemala on the other cannot fail to be sensibly increased. A lot of goods that were being manufactured in England were coming through Belize. And as you all know, the ships cannot come into Belize as such, the huge ones. So you have to unload, put it on smaller boats that come up all the way to that would come up all the way to the up the Golfo Dulce, and from there take it to Guatemala City. Now what they were saying is, if we can get it from Puerto Barrios to Guatemala City, better yet, we don't have to come through to Rio Dulce. And so this is what they were looking for. And very importantly is how this Article 7 closes. Okay. They cannot fail to be sensibly increased at the same time that the limits of the two countries being now clearly defined, and encroachments by either party on the territory of the other will be effectually checked and prevented in the future. This became the bone of contention. To this day, this is the reason why Belize and Guatemala are at the ICJ. Article 8 said that they would ratify the treaty and then exchange it either at London or Guatemala within 6 months. And the people who signed off on this treaty were Charles Lennox White for Guatemala and Pedro de Charles Lennox White for England and Pedro de Aycinena for Guatemala. So what's the controversy? I have tried to set it out in the shortest way possible. Article 7 says we need to construct a road. Guatemala says, yeah, that's fine. But you know what? Your road, you should pay for it. I am not going to pay for it because I gave you land south of the Sibun, all the way to the Sarstoon. So in other words, Guatemala was saying this is compensation. England was saying, how will I pay you for something that I already own, for something I am already using? Britain says, listen, this is a simple demarcation exercise. Guatemala says, no, 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 no. Si yo te estoy dando más y tú no estás poniendo nada. So that then is the bone of contention. That is the part of the problem. Was the demarcation done correctly? The answer is yes. In 1860, the British appointed Major Henry Ray as their commissioner. Guatemala appointed Don Manuel Cano Madrazo. I hear some people laughing when I said that last word just now. Manuel Cano Madrazo. And the arbiter came from Honduras, and his name was Manuel Perez de la Sala. So the survey was done between 1860 and 1861. They went to demarcate the boundaries. At this time, Huayca and Aycinena are waiting for the report. When the report comes in, they had originally thought that the road would have cost only 80,000 pounds, but the actual cost was twice as much. And so Guatemala then begins to insist, how will something that cost 80,000 pounds you're going to be enjoying? And so that is the bone of contention to this day between Guatemala and Belize as regards the territory. Any questions? If none, it was until the 5th of August, 1863, that Britain agreed with Guatemala that they would do something about that road construction. They found out that it would be about 121,000 pounds for materials and manual labor. Paying for the engineers would cost 24,150 pounds. And so they find that they would be short of money. And so they make an additional convention in August 1863, whereby Her Britannic Majesty said, all right, I will recommend and I will find the monies due you. But I guess that was a little late. And so that brings me to the end of the presentation. How colonization starts off with the access to resources, how it played out into a geopolitical strategic game, and how diplomatic forces would prevail into establishing a boundary for what today we know as Belize. Yet, many moons after, there is a query on the part of Guatemala, which has now been taken to the International Court of Justice. Any questions? Any comments?
If you have any questions, please ask these right now.
Wow, seems like my explanations are very clear.
Well, if um, this is why I have my reservations with online sessions, Mr. Giovanni. But
Yep.
well, I hope you took down your notes. You will be tested on this over the weekend, so make sure that you review all these information and read the assigned essays in the book readings. Remember that we are going to meet tomorrow at 4 for the presentations on slavery. Thank you very much, Mr. Giovanni, for taking your time. I know you're a busy person, especially with this new post as administrator. And I'm really grateful for you fitting us in, no, during these past 2 weeks.
Yeah, no problem. Like I said, no, and it's a pity that the workload. Well, it's the period of transition is such that my time is kind of limited, but I'm glad to share of my knowledge with you all, and I'm happy that you agreed to make way, no, for us to do this type of presentation. Um, yeah, and so to finalize just this last slide, if you notice, England went on to say that they were the empire upon which the sun never set. And these are some of the major territories that they established control of. We would be placed in the section called West Indies at the bottom there.
Yes, I was thinking that although we became a crown colony up until 1862, kind of 200 years after occupation, the question is, were we a colony before? I mean, informally, I guess we were. So that's, no, it kind of brings us to question first, why until 1862, Britain declares us a crown colony and not before. So
yeah, and the reason is that the English who settled in Belize, the British or the Scottish who settled in Belize, they all had different flares. They were more independent of the monarchy. And so there wasn't really, in as much as they had a system of governance, it was more where they could benefit. It was more about where they could benefit individually than moving forward together. And as North American, US power began to expand, they saw it as a threat. And so, and then to add insult to injury, the British lost. They lost in what was the battle against the Maya in Belize. And that is a chapter, that's another chapter of our history that is not brought out consistently.
yeah.
But
Yeah,
we know, for example,
we're covering that next week. And you know Del Merced?
yeah,
Delmer will be presenting next week.
Okay, good, good,
Yeah.
excellent.
And,
Yeah,
and
and
I don't know if you have read the book Maximo.
actually, I provided information to Carmen Carrillo
Okay.
on Maximo.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
PDF. So the students are supposed to read the book in preparation for that.
Yep. Yeah, Maximo was he became the last version of Marcos Canul as that type of militant person, but militant in his own way, given the circumstances of the colonial authorities having had control of the territory, and how the British Honduras Company, which is now the Belize State Company Limited, and the great influence that they had over the government system. You know, today we see multinational companies controlling Belize. Some of them have a face and a name. Some of them have faces and names, plural. So we're not out of the woods yet. Our independence is, our political independence is one, but the economic independence is needs to be the second portion. And as long as somebody else is paying your bills, you cannot be independent. As long as you have to import more than you produce, you will not be independent. And it will take you young people,
Yeah, you know, and that
to
that
really
is,
analyze it.
yeah, that is where the role of good governance comes in, no? I mean, it's interesting what Ashcroft said in his interview. I mean, it's quite interesting and funny, but that's the truth. You know, as long as we have leaders who will just really not serve the country and serve the people well, no, that service leadership. I mean, they will just buy into corruption, and the cycle of colonization continues. No?
Yep. Turning a blind eye is not going to solve the matter. And believing that the one-eyed man is king in the kingdom of the blind is still not the answer.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Giovanni. I think many have left already, but yo creo que solo usted y yo estamos hablando acá. Thank you to all who have remained, and all the best. Mr. Giovanni, keep in touch, and we move on, no? Doing
right.
our affairs, our lo que se puede, no? In our own little measure.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Giovanni.
All right. Thank you.
Estoy escuchando, Mr.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Oh, you're there. Ahí estaban todavía, qué bueno.
Vamos a escuchar.
All right. That sounds good. That sounds good.